I will be analyzing Matthew V. Novenson's chapter titled Paul's Former Occupation in Iudaismos. Novenson's thesis is that when Paul uses the verb iudaizo, he is referring to the act of non-Jewish people who adopt Jewish native religious customs and practices, and that iudaismos refers specifically to the promotion of Jewish custom by Jewish people. The following will highlight the biblical, theological presuppositions of Novenson, his hermeneutical and exegetical approach, the strengths and weaknesses of his argument, and offer practical ministry applications. First, with respect to biblical and theological presuppositions, against modern standard translations of iudaismos as Judaism, Novenson maintains that in Galatians 1, Paul is not referring to a polemic against the religion of Judaism, but that he uses the term in a personal sense to refer to his own zealous activity in conscripting Gentiles to Jewish customs. The resultant biblical presupposition is that Paul was not critical of Judaism wholesale and even continued in his ancestral traditions after he converted to Christianity. If Paul is not condemning Judaism, then it is necessary for Novenson to draw a distinction of the form of Judaism that Paul practiced before his conversion and the customs that he continues to practice. However, in my opinion, he fails to discuss this in much detail. Moreover, Novenson agrees with general convention that the verbal idea of iudaizo means to adopt Jewish customs, or more specifically, live as one bound by Mosaic ordinance or traditions, or to live in Judean or Jewish fashion. However, Novenson unnecessarily presupposes that Paul's use of the term in Galatians 1 reverberates from its political and activistic sense during the Maccabean revolt. In terms of his hermeneutical and exegetical approach, Novenson's argument centers heavily on the etymology of iudaismos and its cognates. However, he also relies upon the historical and cultural context to determine its meaning. On the question of who does iudaismos, Novenson allows the context of Galatians 1 and its historical use to drive his answer. Novenson mentions that iudaismos is used in only a few extra-biblical resources to refer to the activity of Jews to proselytize Gentiles, but makes little mention of those sources. And despite few extant references to the term, Novenson does not allow etymology alone to determine the meaning of iudaismos, arguing from syntax that Paul's use of the word makes no mention of Gentiles and that he himself is the subject of the verbal idea. Moreover, he also refers to several extra-biblical Roman epigraphs that contextually suggest that iudaismos referred to activities that Jews themselves do. Novenson's precise definition of iudaismos is informed by its genesis in the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, in which it was used to contrast to Hellenismos, which is the adoption of Greek customs by non-Greeks. According to Novenson, the use of iudaismos in 2nd Maccabees suggests that the Jewish people sought to defend their ancestral Jewish customs and practices against Greek influence. Now, in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of Novenson's argument, there are admittedly few extant references to iudaismos, both in biblical and extra-biblical literature. However, Novenson ostensibly derives his definition from its limited use in the Maccabean revolt. Novenson takes too much of an exegetical leap, in my opinion, in suggesting that its limited use in Maccabees refers to political and activistic Judaism and demands that it must be used in the same way by Paul in Galatians 1. Novenson is seemingly close to the idea that a Jewish person could have rejected Hellenization and maintained their ancestral customs, yet was not zealous per se. However, the inherent strength of this argument is Novenson's assessment on the timing of iudaismos, namely that it began to be used only after the persecution of the Jews under Antiochus IV. Even still, Novenson fails to address if or how the etymology of iudaismos evolved until Paul's writing of Galatians. A second weakness of Novenson's argument is his claim that the Jewish people did not need to defend their ancestral traditions before Antiochus IV. While it should be conceded that the term iudaismos was born out of Antiochus' persecution of the Jews, Jewish people endured persecution before Antiochus IV and defended their traditions accordingly. One need look no further than a century earlier, even when the Ptolemies entered Jerusalem on the Sabbath, because they knew that the law prescribed that no Jewish man would fight on the Sabbath or should fight on the Sabbath. In fact, many Jewish people were taken captive into Egypt, and the Ptolemies ruled Israel for many years to come. Moreover, when Antiochus III ruled Israel, he allowed the Torah to be the national law of Israel and gave them autonomy, likely suggesting that he did so to appease these more orthodox Jewish people to retain power after their harsh treatment under Ptolemy. Thus, to suggest that the Jewish people did not need to defend their faith is up until the rule of Antiochus IV is really a misnomer. Antiochus IV's persecution of the Jews stemmed from his response to an Orthodox Hasidim who mounted a resistance movement against him. It is not responsible to assume that Iudesmos only refers to defense of Jewish traditions under duress, since Antiochus IV was responding to a specific movement of Jewish people who had been preserving and were zealous about their ancestral traditions really all along. So in other words, while the author of Maccabees may have coined the term Iudesmos, it should not be assumed that the Jews did not actively need to choose, maintain, or defend their customs, or that they were not political or zealous Jews prior to the Maccabean revolt. Novenson suggests that certain Jewish people did not become zealous about their traditions until the Maccabean revolt. However, as demonstrated here, this assertion really is demonstrably false. And a final weakness worth mentioning is Novenson's conclusion that Paul anticipates that the messianic ingathering of Israel will, quote unquote, take care of itself through Peter's ministry. This conclusion is based on unsubstantiated internal evidence, especially in light of the fact that in the same letter, Paul details how he opposed Peter for his refusal to fellowship with Gentiles for fear of breaking the Mosaic law. Thus, if Peter was guilty of deviating from the truth of the gospel in the immediate context, it seems unlikely that Paul would place complete trust in Peter to convert the Jewish people, as Novenson suggests. The greatest strength, in Novenson's argument, lies in his analysis of the internal syntactical evidence, which suggests that, quote, use belies etymology when defining Iudesmos. The traditional pattern would suggest that the noun form of Iudesmos, of the verb iudazo, would mean, quote, the observance of Jewish customs by non-Jewish persons. However, Paul identifies himself as a subject of the verbal idea and nowhere mentions Gentiles in his argument, making the above or his definition impossible since he was a Jew. Now, in terms of the practical ministry implications, Novenson's thesis is not overwhelmingly convincing based upon the evidence that he presents. However, he vaguely alludes to the idea that Christians should continue to evangelize to the Jewish people. From the time of Paul's writing to the Romans, Jewish people who observe Jewish practices continue to maintain that Jewish righteousness is a function of works. And it can be reasonably concluded that Judaism has evolved so that works-based righteousness has become increasingly inculcated into Jewish religious practice. Paul preached a gospel to the Jewish people that reflected God's abiding love for his covenant people, as should the modern church. And assuming Novenson's hypothesis is true, it provides personal application for believers in the modern context. Christians who are zealous to prioritize church practices, customs, and traditions, even to the point of harassing other church members who threaten their traditions, are behaving really no different than Paul before his conversion to Christ, creating internal division and turmoil. Preservation of religious customs and practices cannot produce societal righteousness. However, both in Paul's context in Galatians and in the modern context, faith in Christ is the crux upon which religious observance is to be founded.